All right, our reporter Lerato Tipa there in Port Elizabeth. Let's move over to other news now. Day one of the Russia-Africa summit has wrapped up in Sochi, where 40 heads of state from Africa, including President Cyril Ramaphosa, are holding talks with President Vladimir Putin. President Ramaphosa held a bilateral meeting with his Russian counterpart, focusing on trade and military cooperation. SABC correspondent Neha Poonia is in Sochi for us. She joins us now. Hi, Neha. Thanks indeed for your time. I mean, this day one, of course, coinciding with the landing of these bomber jets here in South Africa. Obviously, one of the strongest points of Russia is its military imports and cooperation in Africa.
That's right. 1 out of 7 exports that come from Russia to Africa are arms, and it has military cooperation agreements with 15 countries in the continent. But this kind of military cooperation between South Africa and Russia is rare, and the timing is symbolic. Just hours after the two leaders held their bilateral here in Sochi, you had that announcement coming through from the Russian Defense Ministry confirming that blackjack bomber jets would be flying to South Africa, landing there for a friendly exercise between two nations that want to enhance their military cooperation. This also signifies that Russia is clearly banking on those capabilities that set it apart from countries like the US, India and China. President Putin, speaking here at the plenary session, did say that trade with African nations has expanded quite significantly over the last several years, growing by almost 20%, but it's still not big enough when you compare it to, let's say, China's trade with the continent, which is 10 times more. He said that they want to diversify beyond arms trade, but clearly for now Russia banking on its biggest strength, which is military capability.
All right, let's talk about day one and what's dominating, of course, the talks there, as President Putin, of course, wooing more than 40 heads of state from the African continent.
That's right. It's the first time we've seen a summit like this being held in Russia. Summits between African nations and other countries aren't uncommon. You've got India, China and the US holding them almost on an annual basis. The UK saying it wants to hold an Africa Investors Summit early next year as well. But Russia clearly announcing its presence as far as the scramble for the continent is concerned. President Putin getting right off the bat to the issue that concerns him the most, which is trade with the continent. He says it's increased by almost 20% in the last several years. His colleagues, he said, jokingly said that that's a healthy increase, but he's not satisfied with that. He wants to see that number double in the next 5 years. That's a target he set for himself. Also, interestingly, the bilateral between President Ramaphosa and President Putin was deemed a success. You could see the kind of equation the two leaders share. President Ramaphosa thanking him for the invitation, saying he's made good on his promise of visiting Russia to try and see ways that they can enhance this bilateral cooperation beyond the strategic partnership they already share.
This is also an opportunity for African leaders, of course, to engage with Moscow in a meaningful way. In particular, if we look at, the Africa Free Trade Agreement, it's also an opportunity to engage with Moscow on that.
That's right. That's something that President Ramaphosa mentioned himself, saying that there's a lot of potential in this relationship that hasn't yet been tapped into. One, of course, representing the Africa Free Trade Area, saying this is perhaps the largest economy when you look at the combined might of all of the African nations, saying that that's what he would like Moscow to focus on. Speaking of Russia, it's also important why it's suddenly looking at Africa with renewed interest. It's dealing with sanctions from the West. Its own economy is stagnating, pegged to grow at only about 1% this year. So it's in desperate need of new allies, of new markets it can export its products to. Many experts we've spoken to said that it's also important because this is coming at a time when, while the rest of the world is not doing so well economically, you've got most African economies growing and pegged to grow at more than 5%. So this is a huge opportunity for Russia, and one that it's hoping to make good on. And also the message is this isn't a one-time exercise. They're hoping to keep doing this almost every year on an annual basis to ensure that the engagement isn't short-lived.
Yeah, thank you so much indeed, Neha Poonia, crossing to us live from Sochi. Of course, more than 40 African heads of state in Russia, of course, for a summit there. The talks, day one today, talks on the sidelines as well. President Cyril Ramaphosa meeting with the Russian President Vladimir Putin. Quite a lot of discussions there underway about how Russia, of course, how we can strengthen bilateral relations between Africa and Russia.